Have you ever noticed how life works in these unexpected moments? When you're standing at the edge of everything you thought you knew? When the world suddenly feels too big and too small at the same time? And you don't even recognize yourself anymore? This is a story about a woman named Sarah who found herself in exactly that place, broken, alone, and desperate enough to cry out into the darkness. What she didn't know was that her call would reach someone whose simple act of kindness would change the entire direction of her life. This isn't a story about grand gestures or romantic rescues. It's about one person noticing another person's pain and deciding that their help mattered. It's about what happens when strangers become lifelines. Sarah had always been the kind of person who kept everything together. Her colleagues at the marketing firm knew her as the one who stayed late, who always had the answer, who never showed weakness. She was 34 years old, professional, accomplished by any measure, and completely falling apart on the inside. Nobody knew this except her, and she'd gotten very good at hiding it. For years, she had managed a perfect exterior, the right clothes, the right job, the right apartment in the right neighborhood. But perfection is exhausting, and Sarah was tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. The morning it all fell apart started like any other morning. Sarah woke up at 6 o'clock, went through her routine, and put on her armor of makeup and professional clothing. She drove to her office, sat at her desk, and tried to focus on the presentation due that afternoon. But something inside her had shifted. It was like a small crack in a dam, and once it started, nothing could stop the water from pouring through. By noon, she couldn't breathe. Her hands were shaking, her heart was racing, and she couldn't remember what she was supposed to be working on. The walls of her office felt like they were closing in. She didn't tell anyone. She just grabbed her purse and walked out. She didn't give notice, didn't send an email, didn't do any of the professional things she was supposed to do. She just left. Her boss would call later, concerned and confused. Her best friend would text, wondering if everything was okay. But Sarah didn't respond to anyone. She drove without a destination, just away from the office, away from the city, away from the life that had been slowly suffocating her. She found herself on rural highways she'd never been on before, driving through towns she'd never heard of. The landscape around her began to change. Fewer buildings, more open space, rolling hills and endless sky. She had grown up in the suburbs and had lived her entire adult life in cities, so this kind of emptiness was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She drove for hours, watching the sun move across the sky, not thinking about anything in particular, just existing in the strange space between panic and numbness. It was almost evening when she realized she was completely lost. She had no signal on her phone, no idea which direction she'd come from, and no idea where she was going. Instead of panicking, she actually felt a strange sense of relief. Being lost was honest, at least. There was no pretending when you were this far from civilization. She pulled off the road near a small fence line and just sat in her car, staring at the landscape. The sky was turning golden, and the wind was making waves in the tall grass. But as night fell, everything changed. The darkness seemed to come all at once, and with it came the reality of her situation. She was alone in a place she didn't know. Her phone had no signal. Her gas tank was getting low, and she was starting to feel genuinely afraid. She had run away from her life without any plan, without thinking about what would happen next. She was sitting in a car on a deserted road with no idea who she was or what she was doing. The panic that she'd been running from caught up with her all at once, and it was worse than anything she'd felt before. Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her hands started shaking again. She felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of the world closing in. This time, though, there was no office building to escape from, no city to drive away from. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped with herself and all the things she'd been avoiding. She thought about her parents, who had always expected so much from her. She thought about her ex-boyfriend, who had told her she was too ambitious and too cold. She thought about her job, which had consumed the last 10 years of her life and left her empty. She thought about all the moments when she'd chosen work over relationships, achievement over happiness, perfection over authenticity. The panic attack came on with full force. She felt like she couldn't breathe, like her heart might burst right out of her chest, like she was dying. And in that moment of absolute terror, with nothing left to hold on to, she did something she rarely did. She cried, not quiet tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. She cried for every time she'd pretended to be fine when she wasn't. She cried for every moment she'd chosen the wrong thing. She cried because she didn't know who she was anymore, and she didn't know how to get back to being herself, or if there even was a self to go back to. She was so consumed by her panic that she almost didn't hear the truck at first. It was an old pickup, the kind you see in rural areas, and it was slowing down as it approached her car. She immediately felt a jolt of fear. She was a woman alone on a deserted road at night. Every safety warning she'd ever heard suddenly came flooding back. She locked her car doors and tried to compose herself, wiping her tears away, trying to look less terrified than she felt. But there was no hiding her puffy eyes and red face. The truck came to a stop beside her car. Through the darkness, she could make out a figure in the driver's seat, but couldn't see much beyond that. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. She wasn't sure what she was more afraid of, the stranger in the truck, or the fact that she was completely alone and vulnerable in a way she'd never been before. She watched as the door of the truck opened, and a man's boots hit the ground. He was tall, weathered, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent his whole life working outdoors. His face was lined and sun-darkened, his hair grey at the temples. He was wearing a worn cowboy hat and a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm evening. He approached her car carefully, as if trying not to startle her further. He held his hands up in a non-threatening gesture and waited until she rolled down her window just a crack before speaking. "You all right there?" His voice was low and gentle, nothing like she would have expected.
I saw you pulled over and thought I'd check.
Engine trouble? He didn't ask what she was doing there or why she looked like she'd been crying. He just asked the practical question, giving her an easy explanation to hide behind if she wanted one. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. I'm lost. My phone doesn't have signal, and I don't know where I am." She could feel her voice shaking, could feel the vulnerability pouring out of her. She was too tired to pretend anymore. "I don't know anything right now." He took a step back, respecting her space. "Name's Jack. I live about a mile down the road. Look, I don't want to presume anything, but you don't look like you're in a good place to be out here alone. Can I help? I can at least give you a place to pull your car, use a phone with better signal, get you some water and coffee." It was the most dangerous thing she could do, get in a truck with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. But Sarah was past the point of playing it safe. Playing it safe had gotten her where she was, and there was something in Jack's manner that suggested he wasn't a threat. He was offering help pure and simple, without judgment or curiosity about what had brought her to this point. She felt tears starting again. "You're safe," Jack said, and those 3 words broke something open in her. Nobody had told her that in so long. Nobody had made her feel like she could let her guard down, like it was okay to not be okay. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." Sarah nodded, and in that moment, her life began to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. She pulled her car to start it, following Jack's truck down a dark road toward a small house on a cattle ranch, toward kindness from a stranger, toward the first real rest she'd experienced in years. She didn't know that this moment would become the turning point, the thing that would eventually teach her how to live again. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time she didn't feel alone. The ranch house wasn't what Sarah had imagined. She'd expected something rustic but neglected, the home of a man living alone. Instead, she found a place that was worn but cared for, modest but filled with purpose. The exterior was weathered wood painted a soft grey, with a large porch that wrapped around the front. Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee and something warm, and the living room had high ceilings with exposed beams. There were books everywhere, some piled neatly, others stacked randomly on tables and shelves. It felt lived in, genuine. Nothing like the carefully curated apartment she'd left behind in the city. Jack moved through the space with a quiet competence that reminded Sarah of someone who had lived a long time with just himself and his work. He put water on to boil, pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, and gestured for her to sit. He didn't ask many questions. He simply got her water, made her coffee, and left her to collect herself while he moved through the kitchen with the kind of ease that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. There was something almost meditative about watching him work. He was fully present in everything he did, not rushing, not thinking about what came next. "You want to talk about it?" he asked as he set the coffee in front of her. "Or you just want to be quiet for a while?" Sarah looked at the cup, at the steam rising from it, at this man who had no reason to care about her problems and yet somehow seemed to care anyway. "I don't even know where to start," she said. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense. I walked out of my job today without telling anyone. I just left. I got in my car and I drove, and I didn't stop until I had no idea where I was anymore. And then I had a panic attack, and you showed up, and now I'm sitting in your kitchen and I don't know anything about myself anymore." Jack nodded slowly, as if this all made perfect sense to him. He didn't look shocked or judgmental. He just pulled out a chair for himself and sat down across from her. "That takes courage," he said. "Most people spend their whole lives not doing exactly what you did today. Most people keep going, keep pretending, keep walking the same path even when it's killing them. It might not feel like it right now, but what you did takes real courage."
It feels like I'm losing my mind,
Sarah said, and the admission surprised her. She'd never said that out loud before. "It feels like I'm falling apart, and I don't know how to put myself back together." "You don't have to figure that out tonight," Jack said. "You just have to sleep. Your mind is tired, your body is exhausted, and you're running on panic. None of that is a good place to make decisions or understand yourself. Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow is time enough to figure out the next thing." He showed her to a small guest room on the first floor, gave her clean towels, and left her alone. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and felt something inside her finally begin to settle. She took a shower, changed into the clothes that Jack had left for her, soft sweatpants and a t-shirt, and lay down in the bed. The sheets smelled like fabric softener and sun. The pillow was soft, and for the first time in what felt like years, she let herself sleep without fighting it. When Sarah woke up the next morning, light was streaming through the windows, and she could hear the sounds of the ranch in motion. There were animal sounds, the creak of gates, the distant sound of an engine. She lay in bed for a while, just listening, trying to understand where she was and what it meant. The panic of the night before had faded, replaced by something more manageable, a kind of gentle confusion about what came next. She got up and found Jack already working, out in the yard with the cattle. He looked up when she stepped onto the porch, and he smiled. It was a genuine smile, not trying too hard, just recognizing that she was there. He walked over to the porch and leaned against the railing. "Sleep okay?" he asked. "Better than I have in years," she said. And it was true. "Thank you for everything, for stopping, for letting me stay." Jack shrugged like it was nothing. "You hungry? I was just about to come in and make some breakfast. Nothing fancy, but I can make eggs and toast." They spent the morning together in a way that Sarah wasn't used to. They weren't trying to impress each other or perform. They just existed together in the space of the kitchen, eating breakfast, drinking coffee, and talking about small things. Jack told her about the ranch, about the cattle operation he ran mostly by himself, about the challenges of ranching in a changing climate. He didn't ask her personal questions. He just let her be in his space and accepted her presence without demanding anything from her. After breakfast, Jack needed to work, and Sarah found herself asking if she could come along and help. She'd never done physical labor in her life. Her hands were soft from years of office work. Her back was weak from sitting at desks all day, and her arms had no strength in them. But she wanted to try. She wanted to do something real, something that produced a tangible result, instead of the abstract work she did in marketing that sometimes felt empty. Jack gave her a pair of work gloves and showed her how to help move cattle to a different pasture. It was hot, it was dusty, and it was nothing like anything she'd ever done before. But as she worked, as she felt her muscles strain and burn, as she got dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her face, something shifted inside her. She was actually doing something. Her body was being used for real work instead of just carrying her through the day. She was helping, even in a small way, with something that mattered. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah felt herself calming down in a way she didn't expect. The constant chatter in her mind, the worry, the shame, the panic, began to quiet. There was just the work, and her body doing the work, and the presence of Jack moving around her, teaching her things, showing her how to do things she'd never done before. It was meditative. It was healing. Around midday, Jack brought out water and sat with her in the shade. And that's when Sarah finally started talking. She told him about her job, about the pressure to be perfect, about the years she'd spent climbing a ladder that was leaning against the wrong building. She talked about her family and how they'd always expected so much from her. She talked about the relationships she'd lost because she was always working, always pushing, always too focused on achievement to notice the people who mattered. She talked about waking up one day and realizing that she'd spent 10 years becoming someone she didn't want to be. Jack listened without interrupting. He didn't try to fix her problems or give her advice. He just listened. And that simple act of being heard began to heal something in her that had been broken for a very long time. Over the next week, Sarah fell into a rhythm on the ranch. She would wake up early, eat breakfast with Jack, and spend her days doing real work. Her hands developed calluses, her skin darkened from the sun. She learned the names of the cattle, learned which ones were gentle and which ones were stubborn, learned how to read the animals and understand what they needed. She learned that work could be honest and simple and deeply satisfying in ways that her office job never had been. She and Jack didn't talk about her staying permanently. They didn't talk about the future. They just existed together in the present, and Sarah found that this was exactly what she needed. There was no pressure to be anything other than what she was. There was no performance, no expectation, no judgment. Jack had somehow created a space where she could simply be human, could be lost and confused and uncertain, and that was completely acceptable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as the sun set, and sometimes Jack would tell her stories about his own life. He had been married once, many years ago, and his wife had passed away from cancer. They'd never had children. He had thrown himself into the ranch work after she died, and for a long time he'd just been going through the motions. But slowly, the work itself had become healing. The cattle had become companions. The land had become a teacher. He had learned to live with grief instead of running from it. "I think that's what you need to do too," Jack said one evening as they watched the sky turn purple and orange. "Not run from what you're feeling, but actually feel it. Let it be there. Let it teach you something about yourself." Sarah listened to the wisdom in his words, and she began to understand that everything she'd been running from was actually the thing that could save her. Her panic attack hadn't been a sign that something was wrong with her. It had been her body and mind telling her that she was living wrong, that she needed to change. And instead of medicalizing it or trying to fix it quickly, she needed to actually pay attention to what it was trying to tell her. By the end of the second week, Sarah had made a decision. She wasn't ready to go back to the city. She wasn't ready to return to her old life. But she also knew that she couldn't stay on Jack's ranch indefinitely, using him as an escape from her problems. She needed to figure out her life, but she needed to do it from a place of strength, from a place where she'd learned to breathe again. She shared this with Jack, and instead of acting hurt or disappointed, he nodded as if he'd been expecting exactly this. "There's an old cabin about 3 miles from here," he said. "It's been empty for years, but it's solid. It's yours if you want it. You could stay there while you figure things out. I can use your help on the ranch and you can have your own space. No pressure to figure out your whole life, but you'll have a place to do it from." Sarah felt tears in her eyes again. But these were different tears. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition that something true was happening. She had come to this place as a broken person, and she was beginning to heal. She had met someone who saw her not as a project to fix, but as a person worth helping. And she was learning that sometimes the most powerful thing that can happen is when one person simply decides that another person matters. The cabin was smaller than Sarah had expected, but it was perfect. It had 2 rooms, a basic kitchen, a small wood-burning stove, and large windows that looked out over the ranch land. Jack and some neighbors helped her clean it up and fix the roof, which had started to leak. Within a few days, it was habitable. Sarah moved her few belongings from the motel room where she'd spent the first few days, and she settled into a new home. Her first decision was to not go back to the city immediately. She called her office and explained that she was taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. Her boss, surprisingly, was understanding about it. "Take the time you need," he said, "but if you want to come back, we'll make it work." It was a generous offer, and it took some of the panic out of her situation. She had options, which meant she had freedom. She also called her mother, something she'd been dreading. She expected judgment, expected disappointment, expected her mother to immediately start listing reasons why Sarah was making a terrible mistake. But instead, her mother listened. Sarah told her everything about the panic attacks, about the feeling of emptiness despite all her achievements, about running away, about meeting Jack, about working on the ranch. Her mother was quiet for a long time after Sarah finished. "I'm sorry," her mother finally said. I'm sorry that I spent so much time pushing you to achieve that I never asked if you were happy. I'm sorry that I made you feel like you had to be perfect. I think you're doing the right thing. I think you needed to do this." The conversation didn't solve everything between them, but it opened a door. It suggested that there could be a different kind of relationship with her mother going forward. One where achievement wasn't the only currency, where being human was enough. In the cabin, Sarah began to do something she'd never done before. She began to figure out who she actually was, separated from expectations, separated from achievements, separated from performance. She had a journal, something she'd never kept before, and every morning she would write in it. At first, the pages were messy and disorganized, filled with confusion and anger and pain. She wrote about the years she'd lost, about the relationships she'd damaged, about the parts of herself she'd sacrificed for success. But slowly, the writing began to shift. She started writing about what she noticed. The way the morning light looked different depending on the time of year. The way the cattle moved like a single organism with 1,000 hearts. The way quiet could be so loud that it taught you how to listen. She worked with Jack most days, but not every day. She gave herself permission to rest, to read, to think, to simply exist without the constant pressure of productivity. She read books she'd never had time for, novels and memoirs and poetry. She started sketching, something she'd loved as a child but had given up when practical concerns took over. She taught herself to cook using old cookbooks she found in antique shops in the nearby small town. About a month into her time in the cabin, Jack invited her to a dinner at his house. He'd invited some neighbors, people he'd known for years. There was Betty and her husband Tom, who owned a smaller ranch nearby. There was Marcus, who ran a veterinary clinic in the next town over. There was Elena, who had started an organic farm and was doing interesting work with sustainable agriculture. These were real people doing real work, and Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying their company. They didn't ask about her career or her achievements. They asked about her interests and her experiences. They treated her as an equal, not as someone to be evaluated. Elena particularly interested Sarah. She had left a corporate job years ago and she'd started the farm from almost nothing. She was successful in a way that mattered to her. She was doing work that aligned with her values. She was making a good living, and she seemed genuinely happy. "The thing is," Elena said to Sarah one evening when they were talking on Jack's porch, "I spent so many years doing what I was supposed to do. I got the degree, got the job, climbed the ladder. And one day I realized that climbing a ladder was easier than figuring out what I actually wanted to climb toward. So I jumped off. It was terrifying, but it was the best thing I ever did." After the dinner, Sarah drove back to the cabin and sat in the darkness thinking about what Elena had said. She thought about the panic attack that had brought her here, and she realized that it hadn't been a breakdown. It had been a breakthrough. Her mind and body had staged a kind of intervention, had forced her to stop and pay attention to what really mattered. Over the following months, Sarah's life began to take a new shape. She wasn't planning it or forcing it. Things just began to happen. She started working with Elena on the farm a few days a week, learning about sustainable agriculture, understanding how to grow food and care for the land. She realized she had an interest in environmental work that she'd never explored before. She thought about going back to school, maybe in sustainable agriculture or environmental science. She thought about using her marketing skills in a different way, maybe to help smaller companies that were doing meaningful work. She reconnected with some of her old friends, the ones she'd neglected during her years of focused career ambition. Some of those friendships were dead, killed by years of distance and neglect, but others came alive again. She found herself having real conversations, being vulnerable, letting people see her struggles instead of pretending everything was fine. One evening, 6 months after arriving at the ranch, Sarah and Jack were sitting on the porch of the cabin, and Jack said something that surprised her. "I think you're going to leave soon," he said. "Not because something's wrong, but because you're ready. You're strong enough now to go out into the world and be exactly who you want to be." Sarah felt fear at the thought, but it was different fear than she'd felt before. It wasn't the fear of failing. It was the fear of stepping into something unknown. And that was a fear worth having. It meant she was growing. "I don't want to leave you," she said. And she meant it. Jack had become important to her. He had been a safe place to land, a teacher, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. "I know," Jack said. "But you're not the same person who drove up to my ranch half a year ago. That girl was broken and scared and had no idea who she was. You're still learning who you are, but now you're strong enough to learn it anywhere, with anyone. You don't need me to survive anymore. That means you have a real choice about whether you want me in your life. The realization hit Sarah like a wave. She had been so dependent on Jack's kindness, on the safety of the ranch, that she hadn't noticed when she'd become strong again. But it was true. She could feel her own strength now. She could stand on her own. I want you in my life, Sarah said, but not as the person saving me. As something else. Something real. Jack smiled, that small, genuine smile she'd come to know so well. Then that's what we'll figure out. Over the next month, Sarah began to make plans. She applied to several schools looking at programs in environmental science and sustainable agriculture. She decided she would rent an apartment in the nearby town while she took some prerequisite courses. She could work with Elena on the farm and work part-time to pay for school. It wasn't a complicated plan, but it was her plan. She had made the choice and it felt right. When the day came to pack up the cabin, Sarah found that she didn't feel sad. She felt grateful. This place, this land, this man had given her exactly what she needed in the moment she needed it. But she also didn't need it anymore. She was ready to move forward. Jack helped her pack, and they didn't say much. They didn't need to. They drove into town together, and Sarah pulled into the parking lot of the small apartment she'd found. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Jack helped her carry boxes inside, and when everything was unloaded, he stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression that was both proud and something else. Something deeper. You know what you did? Jack said as he was leaving. You walked into your own darkness and you didn't look away. You felt your fear and you didn't run from it. And you let someone help you, which is maybe the hardest thing of all. You should be proud of that. Sarah thought about that conversation often as her new life unfolded. She took her classes and discovered that she loved learning in this new way, learning about things that excited her rather than things she felt obligated to learn. She worked with Elena and found purpose in work that mattered. She and Jack saw each other regularly, and their relationship evolved into something real and meaningful, based not on rescue but on genuine connection. A year after she'd driven away from her job in panic, Sarah was in a different place entirely. She was no longer the woman who needed to be perfect. She was no longer the woman who measured her worth in achievements and accomplishments. She had learned something that no amount of success could have taught her. She had learned that her worth came from simply being human, from connecting with others, from doing work that meant something, from taking care of herself and the world around her. When people asked her how she'd changed her life so dramatically, she told them the truth. She had a panic attack in the middle of nowhere and a stranger had stopped to help. But it wasn't really about the stranger. It was about what she did with that help. It was about having the courage to accept that she'd been living wrong and having the strength to try something different. The panic attacks still came sometimes, but they were different now. They weren't signs of failure. They were signs that something needed to change, and she'd learned to listen to them. She'd learned to hear what her body and mind were trying to tell her. And she'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending and start being real. Sarah kept a journal still, and she would sometimes read back through the early entries, the ones filled with confusion and pain. They felt like they were written by someone else, someone she used to be, but they also felt important because they reminded her of where she'd been and how far she'd come. They reminded her that breaking down wasn't the same as breaking. Sometimes you have to fall apart to figure out how to put yourself back together in a way that actually works. On quiet evenings in her apartment, or sitting on Jack's porch, or working beside Elena in the fields, Sarah would sometimes think about that first moment when she'd heard Jack's voice in the darkness, when he'd said, "You're safe." Those words had been true in that moment, but they'd come to mean something even more profound over time. She had become safe within herself. She had learned to trust her own intuition, to honor her own needs, to believe that she deserved happiness and meaning and real connection. She had walked into the darkness of her own panic, and a kind stranger had offered his hand. But the real rescue wasn't about being saved by someone else. It was about learning to save herself, about discovering that she had always had the strength to do it. It just took hitting rock bottom to realize it was there.